LRA was back on the bridge in under a minute, still pulling her jacket on as she slid into her station. Outside the viewport, caught in the Sarend Drift's forward lights, a ship drifted. It was a mid-sized cargo hauler, similar in class to their own vessel, and at first glance it looked almost ordinary. Running lights still active, hull intact, no sign of collision or weapons fire. It turned slowly in the void with the unhurried grace of something that had stopped caring where it was going. "Life signs?" Captain Reth asked. "None," the sensor officer replied. "Cause of failure?" A pause. "There isn't one. No impact damage, no weapon signatures, no radiation exposure, no mechanical failure on any system." He looked up from his console, visibly unsettled. "Captain, everything on that ship is functioning perfectly." The crew exchanged glances. A catastrophically damaged ship was frightening. A perfectly functioning ship with no crew was something else entirely. Something that sat wrong in the gut, like a word spoken in a language you almost recognized. LRA pulled up the vessel's transmission log while the others worked. The final entry was time-stamped 31 hours ago. It contained no distress call, no description of what had happened, no evidence of panic or struggle. Just 7 words, written with the flat calm of someone stating an obvious fact. "We crossed the line. We're sorry." She read it 3 times. Each time, the words felt heavier. A drone was dispatched to inspect the interior. The feed came back clear and crisp and deeply wrong. Corridors lit and empty. Cargo holds properly secured. A meal half prepared in the galley with vegetables still on the cutting board. Crew bunks with rumpled blankets, as though their occupants had simply stood up mid-rest and walked away from everything they'd ever known. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no indication of where 16 people had gone. They had not been taken from the ship. LRA checked the vessel's flight recorder carefully, mapping its trajectory against the star charts. She felt the realization settle over her like cold water. "Captain," she said carefully, "this ship didn't drift across the border. It approached it, deliberately, and then..." She hesitated. "And then something happened, and it drifted back." Something happened. She hated how thin those words were. Before Reth could respond, LRA's navigation console began to behave strangely. The display flickered. Not the sharp stutter of system error, but a slow, uncertain fade, as though something outside was gently interfering with the signal. The blue route line dimmed. Coordinates shifted, scrolled, and settled into new configurations she hadn't programmed. Then a new message replaced the old one, letter by careful letter, as if being typed by unseen hands. "Approaching unregistered territory. Captain." Her voice was steady, but only because she was making it so. "The map is changing." Reth crossed to her station and looked at the display for a long moment without speaking. When he finally gave the order, it was quiet and unambiguous. "Reduce speed." Nobody asked why. The question would have required acknowledging what they all already felt, that the pressure in the air had changed, that the darkness ahead felt less like empty space and more like something waiting. The Sarend Drift slowed to a crawl, her engines throttling down to a murmur, and the crew fell into particular silence of people who are trying very hard not to imagine what comes next. LRA turned her instruments toward the blank region on the map. Long-range scanners swept the darkness and returned nothing. No planets, no asteroid fields, no debris, no energy signatures. By every conventional measure, the space ahead was completely empty, but the gravitational sensors told a different story. Mass readings spiked and fluctuated with the erratic urgency of instruments detecting objects too large to ignore. The readings suggested structures, enormous ones, larger than moons, arranged with geometry that felt purposeful rather than natural. LRA adjusted her scan spectrum methodically. Infrared, nothing. Magnetic sweep, nothing. Radiation trace, nothing. The objects registered on gravity sensors and nowhere else, as though they existed in some adjacent layer of reality, close enough to bend space, but unwilling to be seen. "Captain," she kept her voice low, "we are not looking at empty space." The lights dimmed. Every station, every console, every strip of ambient lighting on the bridge dropped simultaneously for exactly half a second. Not the gradual fade of a power fluctuation, but precise, synchronized pulse, as if the ship's electrical systems had blinked. In the viewport, the stars ahead disappeared. Not all of them, not gradually. A section of the starfield simply went dark, as though an immense shape had slid silently between the Sarend Drift and the distant light. Something so massive that it eclipsed whole constellations in its passage, yet made no sound, left no heat signature, generated no detectable engine wake. Then the stars returned. The crew stared at the viewport in silence. No one breathed. No one moved. The moment stretched out like a held note, and then LRA's tactical display erupted with data. A contact, vast and undefined, its edges refusing to resolve into clean geometry. The system struggled to calculate its size, failed, tried again. The contact faded from the display as quickly as it had appeared. Then it reappeared. Closer. "I've got something," the sensor officer said, his voice stripped of all professional composure. "I can't lock it. It keeps." The contact vanished again. A murmur ran across the bridge, too unsteady to be called a conversation. LRA's hands moved across her console with focused urgency, layering scan frequencies, cross-referencing readings, trying to build a coherent picture from instruments that kept contradicting each other. She was so focused that the voice, when it came, made her flinch. It filled the bridge from everywhere and nowhere, calm, clear, and utterly without aggression. Not a shout, not a warning shot, not a display of weaponry. Simply a voice, speaking with the patient certainty of something that had never needed to raise its tone. "Unidentified vessel. State your purpose." The words hung in the recycled air of the bridge. LRA felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, but a recognition, the feeling of suddenly understanding a thing you had long suspected without daring to confirm. Whatever had spoken to them had been there the entire time. While they scanned, while they slowed, while they stared at the ghost ship floating in the dark. It had been watching them with a patience that made her feel very small. The contact reappeared on the tactical display, and this time it did not fade. The shape that resolved on her screen was unlike anything in any database she had ever accessed. The system identified it as a warship, the energy signature, the structural geometry, the weapon configurations, but the word felt laughably inadequate. It was to ordinary warships what a mountain is to a hill. The same category, a completely different order of magnitude. It sat in space ahead of them without moving, without threatening, without doing anything at all except existing, and its existence alone was enough to make every crew member on the Sarend Drift want to be somewhere else. The weapons lock indicator appeared on LRA's console, then the power surge warning, then the shield configuration alert. Not the ship's shields, but the other vessels, cycling through defensive modes with the unhurried efficiency of a predator that has already decided it doesn't need to run. Still the ship didn't move, didn't fire, didn't advance. It simply materialized out of the dark, fully formed and absolute, and let them understand. Captain Ref gripped the edge of his console. His knuckles whitened. "Identify yourself," he said, his voice carrying all the authority he had and none of the certainty. The reply came immediately. "Human fleet, you are trespassing in restricted space." No anger, no posturing, just presence. LRA felt the word move through her like electricity. Human. She had grown up on the stories, as everyone had, fragmented galactic history that most educators treated as mythology, told in the hesitant way of people recounting legends they half believed. A species of startling contradictions, brilliant and violent, creative and destructive, capable of extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty, who had burned through every stage of galactic development at a pace that made other civilizations dizzy to contemplate. They had been part of the galactic community once, briefly, in the way that a storm is briefly part of a coastline, and then, by mutual agreement or mutual fear or something no historical record fully explained, they had withdrawn behind their borders and been quietly, collectively left alone. Not forgotten, never forgotten, just not mentioned. The way you don't mention a scar when you're trying to forget the wound. "Human fleet," Ref repeated, as though saying the words again might make them resolve into something more manageable. The warship appeared fully in the viewport. The viewport was large by cargo vessel standards, designed to give the bridge crew a panoramic view of surrounding space. The human warship filled it. Not most of it, all of it, edge to edge, a wall of dark metal and cold geometry that swallowed the stars like a curtain drawn across the universe. Its surfaces were smooth in places and architecturally complex in others, studded with structures whose purposes LRA could not identify, running no navigation lights, bearing no insignia she recognized. It simply was colossal and patient and completely, terrifyingly indifferent to whether it impressed them or not. LRA realized with clarity that arrived like cold water poured over her thoughts that this was the point. It wasn't trying to frighten them. It wasn't performing power for their benefit. It had simply stopped hiding, the way a deep ocean creature stops hiding when it decides a small fish is no longer worth the effort of concealment. The voice returned unchanged. State your purpose and leave the space, or you will be removed. Not we will destroy you. Not this is your final warning before weapons fire. Removed. The word carried a particular, terrible weight. The implication not of battle, but of inconvenience managed, of a problem solved by hands that didn't need to try very hard. Open a channel, Reth said. His voice had flattened into command reflex, the instinct taking over where reason had momentarily failed. LRA opened the channel. The human ship responded instantly. Its communication systems interfaced with theirs so smoothly it felt like the connection had already been there, waiting. We do not seek war. The voice was the same calm, the same certainty, the same absence of any inflection that might be mistaken for uncertainty. We simply protect what is ours. LRA stared at the transmission readout and understood, in a way she had not fully grasped until this moment, why the galaxy had maintained its silence for so long. Other civilizations declared power loudly. Fleets of ships, broadcasted capability, diplomatic channels through which threats were carefully translated into polite language. The humans didn't declare anything. They didn't need to. The absence of declaration was itself a declaration. We are not concerned with convincing you. We are simply here. She thought of the ghost ship floating at the border, its crew gone, its final log entry written with such quiet resignation. She thought of the trade lanes rerouted centuries ago without explanation, the diplomatic files whose signatories had been erased, the navigation database that simply stopped, as though the galaxy itself had decided that some things were better left undescribed. And she understood. The galaxy hadn't left human space alone out of indifference. It had done so out of collective, inherited understanding, passed down through generations the way certain lessons are passed down. Not as explicit warnings, but as instinct, as gravity, as a simple knowledge that certain borders exist for good reasons that no longer need to be articulated. You didn't ask about human space because the asking itself was the crossing, and the crossing had consequences that erased the people who experienced them before they could report back. They're waiting, LRA said quietly. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. She was just saying it out loud, because saying it made it real, and making it real was the only way to make herself believe it. They're waiting for us to leave. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Then Captain Reth straightened. He drew a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Turn the ship around, he said. Plot a new course. All available speed. The helm officer moved immediately, fingers across the console, pulling up the navigation interface. The Sarend Drift began to turn, her bulk swinging slowly through space, thrusters firing in careful sequence. The warship in the viewport shifted as they moved, tracking them without effort, watching them go with the untroubled attention of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. LRA watched the star maps rearrange themselves on her display as their new heading took shape. The dark border slid toward the edge of the chart. The region of the database that always labeled Undefined began to recede behind them, and as it did, LRA found herself looking at it differently than she ever had before. It wasn't undefined. It had never been undefined. It was precisely, exhaustively defined by its borders, by the ghost ships at its edges, by the ancient rerouted trade lanes and the redacted diplomatic files and the navigation database that simply collectively, respectfully stopped. Every blank space on every map was itself a statement, written in the language of absence. There is something here. We have agreed not to name it. We have agreed not to approach it. We have agreed to let it be. The dark border on her chart was not a failure of exploration. It was a record of a lesson, learned once at tremendous cost and never forgotten. It was cartographic humility. It was a galaxy's way of saying, we know where we end. The human warship did not follow them. It did not fire a parting shot or issue a final communication or make any gesture at all. As the Sarend Drift completed its turn and began to accelerate away, the vast ship simply receded into the darkness from which it had emerged, growing smaller by degrees, until it crossed some threshold of distance and vanished, not with a clean disappearance of the cloaking system engaging, but with the gradual, natural recession of something enormously large growing simply too far away to see, as if it had never needed to be seen at all, as if visibility had been a courtesy, briefly extended and now withdrawn. LRA kept her eyes on the sensors long after the contact had faded from every display. She watched the gravitational reading stabilize, watched the navigation console return to its normal configuration, watched the words approaching unregistered territory dissolve back into familiar blue geometry of charted space. One by one, the warnings cleared. One by one, the systems reported nominal. The stars outside the viewport looked exactly as they always had, cold and beautiful and infinite and utterly indifferent to the smallness of the vessels that moved between them. Nothing marked the space they were leaving. There were no buoys, no warning signs, no physical barriers of any kind. Just space. And somewhere in it, behind them now, a border that had held for centuries without ever needing to be enforced more than once per species. LRA sat back in her chair and looked at the clean blue line of their return route stretching out before her. She looked at the dark region at the edge of the map, growing smaller as they pulled away from it. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the navigator who had first charted that border, centuries ago, who had approached it as she had approached it, curious and methodical, following the thread of a mystery toward its source, and had encountered something vast and patient in the dark, and had turned around and had gone home and had made a choice about what to write in the official record and what to leave as silence. She thought about the council that had reviewed that navigator's report and made its own choice, a collective choice, carried forward through every generation since, that some territories were better honored than mapped, that some borders were better respected than tested, and that the highest form of wisdom was sometimes a willingness to stop asking questions. The ghost ship at the border had asked. Its crew had paid whatever price that question carried, and LRA found she could not bring herself to imagine what that price had looked like. She was not sure she wanted to know. She was not sure anyone should. Course locked, the helm officer said. Estimated time to safe space, 4 hours. Good, said Captain Ref. Nothing more. He turned from a viewport and walked to his command chair and sat down, and his face was the face of a man who had just understood something fundamental about the shape of the universe and was still in the process of deciding how to live with that understanding. LRA turned back to her console. She pulled up the navigation database, the full galactic chart, every system, every route, every boundary humanity had ever drawn, and she looked at the dark region in the center of it, undefined space. The words still sat there, patient and permanent, exactly as they always had. She understood now that they were not a failure of description. They were a description of a different kind, precise, deliberate, and complete. They were the galaxy's way of saying, we were here. We looked. We understood what we found. We chose to respect it. We hope you will too. And somewhere in that darkness, something ancient and vast and incomprehensibly powerful continued to do exactly what it had always done. Exist, endure, and watch. Not with malice. Not with hunger. But with a patience so deep and so absolute that time itself seemed to move differently at its edges. LRA closed the chart. She did not file a detailed incident report when they reached port. She noted the encounter in her navigation log as a course correction due to uncharted gravitational interference, and she archived the ghost ship's final transmission with a flag that would ensure it was received by the appropriate parties. The quiet ones, the ones who maintained the silence, the ones who made sure the lesson stayed learned. She never spoke of what she had seen to anyone who hadn't been on that bridge. Not because she had been warned not to, not because she was afraid of what might happen if she did, but because she had looked into the dark between stars and seen something look back, and she had understood, with the full weight of that understanding sitting permanent and unshakable in her chest, that the greatest gift the galaxy had ever given itself was the wisdom to leave some things alone. The Sarend Drift accelerated toward home. Behind her, The edge of the chart held its silence, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, an unmarked memorial to every ship that had approached it, and a monument to all the ones that had, for once, been wise enough to turn back. The stars burned cold and beautiful in every direction, and in the undefined dark, something waited and endured and did not need to be named. Across the galaxy, every ship trusted the navigation network. It was the one constant in a universe of variables, an intricate web of star maps, trade corridors, and charted hazard zones that had guided vessels through the void for centuries. Civilizations rose and fell. Species warred and reconciled. Technologies evolved beyond recognition, but the network endured. It was ancient, reliable, and complete. Almost complete. Navigator LRA discovered the anomaly during the dead hours of the night shift aboard the cargo vessel Sarend Drift, when the rest of the bridge crew dozed at their stations, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engines and the quiet breath of recycled air. She had been reviewing their plotted course out of habit, a ritual she performed 1,000 times without incident, when her console flickered. Just once. A brief, cold stud of light that made her lean forward in her chair. The route stretched out before her on the holographic display, a clean blue line threading through familiar constellations. She traced it with her eyes the way she always did, star by star, waypoint by waypoint. Then the line stopped, not curved, not rerouted, stopped beyond the final waypoint. The chart simply ceased to exist. No stars, no hazard markers, no trade corridors or debris fields or navigation beacons. Just a hard, geometric edge, as though someone had taken a blade to the fabric of the universe and cut away everything beyond it. The space on the other side of that line was not marked as unknown or unexplored or dangerous. It was not marked at all. It was simply absent. A vast, perfectly rectangular darkness in the middle of the galaxy's most meticulously maintained database. Her console displayed 2 words: undefined space. LRA stared at the message for a long moment. System error, she murmured, though her voice carried none of the certainty the words implied. She ran a full diagnostic. Every system returned green. She cross-referenced with the backup charts. The anomaly was identical. She zoomed out until the galaxy spread before her in its entirety. Thousands of star systems, millions of mapped routes, centuries of accumulated navigational data. And there it was, a dark border cutting cleanly through the heart of known space, separating the charted universe from whatever lay on the other side. It wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. She turned in her chair. "Captain," she said quietly, "why is this area not mapped?" The bridge grew still. The subtle hum of the ship seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Captain Reth was a broad man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen more star systems than most crews would cross in a lifetime, and he kept them fixed firmly on the viewport. He did not look at LRA. He did not look at the screen. He simply said, with the careful evenness of a man who had rehearsed a deflection, "Adjust course, 10 degrees starboard." No explanation, no acknowledgement, just avoidance, clean and practiced. LRA held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned back to her console. She didn't sleep during her rest cycle. Instead, she sat at her personal terminal in the dim quiet of her quarters, the glow of the screen painting her face in pale blue light, and she dug. Civilian records returned nothing. The region wasn't classified as dangerous or off-limits. It simply wasn't mentioned at all, as though every database had agreed by silent consensus to pretend it didn't exist. Military files were sealed behind encryption. She had no clearance to breach. Historical archives offered fragments. Trade lanes rerouted without explanation centuries ago. Border agreements signed between parties whose names had been redacted. Council discussions that ended mid-transcript. Then, buried deep in a cache of old navigation logs so ancient their formatting was nearly illegible, she found it. A restricted tag, attached to a file with no title, no summary, no warning label of any kind. Just a classification stamp. Human territory. She reached the file. The proximity alarm split the silence like a knife.